If you are pregnant or you've recently had a baby, this podcast is for you. I am your host, Kath Bequee, a physiotherapist working in women's health and mum of 3. Join me each week as we dive into all things pregnancy care, childbirth and postnatal recovery, helping you have a wonderful pregnancy and afterbirth experience. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. So thank you, Jodie, for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us, Kath.
Oh, it's lovely to see. We're on a Zoom call and I see little Harry and yourself.
Hopefully he goes to sleep. He's thinking about it.
That's okay. So Jodie is a lovely member inside FitNest Mama. And Jodie, you're actually one of the founding members just over 6 months ago now. So blink, you now have a little gorgeous boy, Harry. How old is Harry now?
Yeah, he's about 17 weeks today, I think.
So could you please introduce yourself and let us know who you are in a nutshell?
Yeah, sure. So, Jodie, I'm 38. I live sort of halfway between, got a place in Paran and one in Ballarat, so halfway between the two most times. We've just had little Harry, and he's obviously my first little boy, my first child, and my partner has a 6-year-old daughter as well, so sort of not that we're married, but have a stepdaughter of sorts. So that's us.
So how did the birth journey start for you? Like, where did it all begin?
Yeah, so we fell pregnant sort of after about 6 months or so of thinking that we might start trying. So we were pretty lucky and had a relatively smooth pregnancy, really, albeit COVID. It was in the middle of COVID, so we were very much working from home and, spending a lot of time just sort of bunkering down at home, which was actually lovely. Until sort of we hit 34 weeks and then we hit a bit of a bump in the road, a bit of a scan at 34 weeks, identified we had a bit of a challenge ahead. Harry was diagnosed with CDH, which is Congenital Diaphragmatic Hernia.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, could you explain a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, sure. So I had heard nothing about it, and it's sort of a 1 in every 3,500 births, but essentially the diaphragmatic hernia meant that Harry had a hole in his diaphragm, and it meant that some of his organs had actually been sucked up into his lungs. So his intestine and his spleen were up into his left side of his lung. So it was all pushed up there through the hole, and essentially while he was breathing off me in the placenta, he was breathing just fine, but we didn't really know what it would mean once he was born and how he would go breathing by himself. So, it was all a bit scary, really, to learn what that meant and just to play a bit of a waiting game, I guess, until Harry finally arrived.
I'm sure it all feels like a distant memory now, but do you remember how you felt when you first had that appointment?
Yeah, it was such a shock. I remember it was actually pretty lucky that we ended up having a scan at 34 weeks in the end. We'd actually planned to have the 20-week scan showed a minor sort of abnormality in that the size of his kidneys were slightly skewish. So we were sent back to have just a routine scan at 30 weeks, and that pushed out to 34 because of COVID. So I was in Ballarat and we thought, if we don't have to come back to the city, we'll pad it out a couple of weeks. It wasn't urgent. So got to 34 weeks, went in to have a scan at Cabrini, and I was just by myself because of the COVID situation, and everything was looking normal, and the actual kidney issue that we were in there for had rectified itself. That was absolutely fine. But, our radiographer had obviously hit something he was a bit concerned about. So he said, let's, hop up and let's have a chat. And it took a while to sink in when the radiographer said, this is quite a major issue. I've identified something that, is quite concerning. And he was starting to talk to me about the CDH. And, it certainly took a while for me to sort of register how serious situation it was. And, Mark at the time, the radiographer, was fantastic, and he sort of sat me down, and I think he realised that it hadn't hit home. So he kept talking to me until it did. And then when the tears started coming, he was pretty amazing. And, he was on the phone trying to get us specialist appointments in at the Children's, and immediately transferred my care over to a different obstetrician at Royal Women's, and sort of set the ball rolling for everything we needed to do to be ready for Harry's arrival.
When you mention the seriousness of the situation, could you explain to the listeners what you mean by that? Like what are the implications of CDH?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those scenarios that sort of varies greatly with each different case. So essentially, I think there's varying degrees of it, and we were very, very lucky. And I think we were lucky that Harry's case, the hole hadn't developed in his diaphragm until quite late in the pregnancy, as far as we can tell. And we get mixed reports of whether the hole was there the whole time. It just wasn't big enough, I guess, to suck all the organs up through there until quite late in the pregnancy, or whether the hole actually only came about later in the piece. And certainly when we identified at the 20-week scan that there was a hole there, Mark, the radiographer, went back and had a look at all the scans, and there was just no way that you could identify a hole at 20 weeks. So we were quite lucky in that his case was, I guess, on the mild side of what it could have been. And we pretty much were able to plan, I guess, for the best care that we possibly could when Harry arrived. So that was kind of the key, 34 weeks. So we had to change obstetricians because we couldn't have Harry where we'd planned at Cabrini. We had to go in and have him at the Royal Women's. I had him at Francis Perry, and then Harry had to go straight away to the Royal Children's, and he was basically had to be ready to have surgery to fix the hole within the first few days of his life. So that was all explained to us, but that was really all anyone could tell us because it was very much a wait and see. You know, as soon as Harry arrived, they explained to us it was pretty likely that he would just be intubated straight away. So things would be very different. There'd be a lot of people in the room when I was going through labour and when Harry was about to arrive, and then they'd sort of whisk him straight away off to be intubated and stabilised. And then as soon as he was stable enough, they'd take him down the road to the Royal Children's. And then it was sort of a case to monitor how quickly they could do his surgery to try and repair the hole. And then once that was complete, it was really just wait and see how he was breathing by himself, how strong his lung capacity was. And then there was another asterisk ahead in that babies who had CDH had higher risk of other complications, so things to do with their heart or their breathing or developmental issues. So certainly not out of the woods yet, but so far Harry's just been, you know, kicking all the goals at every goalpost. So we're pretty pleased with how he's come along.
Wow, Jodie, it's such an amazing story. And would you feel your pregnancy was sort of split into two halves, you know, pre-diagnosis and then Can you explain the difference between the two parts of pregnancy, before you knew and after you knew?
Yeah, definitely. I think up until that 34th week, pretty lucky. I didn't have any morning sickness. I had a bit of pelvic pain towards the end of the pregnancy as I was sort of walking distances and getting a little bit of pain, but really nothing major at all. So the pregnancy itself for the first 34 weeks definitely was completely different. And then I think at 34 weeks when we found out about the CDH, again, I was probably lucky for me that I found out late as well, because it allowed me to have those 34 weeks where it was just kind of like ignorant bliss. And then after that, it was definitely difficult to try and sort of stay positive, not knowing what was ahead, not knowing, you know, what sort of complications were going to arise when Harry arrived. And there was a few things we could do, like we had an amniocentesis and a couple of things to try and identify if there were any other complications that came along with his CDH. But I guess the sort of the worst case scenario arose out of the amnio as well, in that they identified that Harry was missing part of a gene, part of a chromosome, but no one could actually identify what that meant. We still don't know to this day what it means that he's missing that particular part of his chromosome, but fingers crossed it actually doesn't mean anything and that he's fine. So, yeah, I guess that last few weeks it's a bit of a blur, but I remember trying to work from home the last couple of weeks of the pregnancy, and that was actually a really good distraction. I remember my mum sort of sitting there, watch me jump on the laptop and do meetings over Zoom, and I'd be crying 1 minute and then I'd jump on the Zoom call and I'd be fine. And she's like, what are you doing? But it was the distraction. I just needed something just to take my mind off thinking about what could be the case.
That element of unknown, would you say that was one of the hardest?
Yeah, 100%. It was definitely the unknown, and just going to every sort of scan and chat to a new specialist. We went to see the doctors at the Children's who were amazing, the surgeons who were going to perform Harry's surgery, and many other specialists, genetic specialists, and people told us what they could. Everyone was amazing that we dealt with, but there was still so much unknown that not even they could answer. That was basically just be prepared for any different scenario to happen.
And so you went from just having your normal obstetrician appointments to suddenly having a whole heap of specialist appointments.
Yeah. As soon as I had the scan at 34 weeks, I did go straight back to my normal obstetrician, and she basically organised for me to be transferred to someone else, another OB at the Royal Women's. And this all happened within sort of 48 hours. My OB was fantastic. She didn't know a lot about CDH. So again, she said, you can't have your baby where we'd planned. You now need to go to a specialist hospital and have these people ready to go. But I can't help you with that. It's not my expertise. So she found someone who could help. And as soon as I went in to see that new OB, Robin was amazing. And she was, organised all these other appointments for us, and everyone at the Women's, the Royal Children's, Francis Perry, was just amazing.
And I remember you mentioning in the lead up to the birth how the focus used to be on the childbirth. But then when you found out that Harry had this issue, suddenly you felt that childbirth would be the easiest part. That's really interesting. So I'd love to dive into that. What happened with the birth process? Did it have to change or?
Yeah, it's funny because for the first sort of 30-something weeks, I thought the labour was going to be the biggest challenge, and I was thinking, oh, God, this is going to be quite an ordeal. But in the end, my mind was completely occupied by the fact that we wanted Harry to be as healthy as possible and focusing on, what happened when he arrived. So, it did take my mind a bit off the childbirth process, but it did change a little bit. So when I went to see Robin, my new OB, she sort of said to us, we will bring Harry along earlier. So I was induced at 38 weeks with Harry, and that was purely to ensure that the experts that needed to be in the room and the team at the NICU at the Royal Women's and then the team at Royal Children's where Harry would be transferred were all ready to go, basically. So, he was induced. I thought that I would have to have a cesarean or something more along the lines of that, but it was actually a natural birth, which was good. So in the end, they actually encouraged me to try and have a natural birth if it was possible, because it meant that as soon as Harry arrived, my recovery would hopefully be a little bit easier in terms of I'd be able to get on my feet and try and go and visit him in his different hospitals. So that was probably the only change.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but if you'd had a cesarean, you would have been in bed for the first few days and you wouldn't have been able to visit Harry easily. Is that right?
Yeah, and that was along this process. I sort of just went, you know what, I've just got to go with the flow, and these people know best. I'll just take their advice on what they think. And Harry was breech the week before he was induced, then he wasn't. He sort of moved around several times. So they said, obviously, if he's breech, we'll have to go down the Caesar route, which is totally fine. But I guess up to you if you want to go natural or Caesar, but it would probably be best if you try for a vaginal birth because of that recovery, that reason that it might enable me to be on my feet a bit quicker and to be able to go and see him at the Children's. Yeah.
So how did you find the process of being induced?
Yeah, it was quite bizarre. I went into my OB the week before that I was being induced, exactly 7 days before, and she did a quick check, and I remember she said, oh, you're actually 1 centimetre dilated already. And I remember thinking, what the hell? And she said, okay, well, you don't actually have to come in the night before like we'd planned to the hospital to be induced. You should be ready to go to come in the morning of, and we'll go from there. So she said, I'll see you in a week. Come in at 7 a.m. and go from there. So it was all a bit surreal, you know, rocking up at the hospital, very planned, me and my partner just driving in going, oh, I think we're going to have a baby today. But, yeah, we got in there at 7. I think my waters, they broke about 8:30. And then, Harry sort of arrived 3:15 that afternoon.
Yep. Tell us more. What happened between 8 and 3:15?
Yeah, so waters broke 8:30. I was all hooked up, obviously, to the monitor. So I was in bed the whole time. And the contractions...
Is that for the extra monitoring of Harry to see how he is going?
Yep, exactly. So not that I'd planned much, but I think I had always thought that I'd be moving around a little bit more, you know, get to have a shower, that sort of thing. But, yeah, it was definitely just, you know, stay in bed and on the monitors, but that was fine. So he had contractions that were fairly manageable for the first few hours. Then when they started getting a bit more intense, I pulled out my TENS machine, and that really worked for me. That just really helped take the edge off. And then I remember it getting a little bit more intense sort of around 12 o'clock-ish, and I was just sort of using the breathing exercises a lot. So they helped me for a while. And then when they started getting a lot more intense, I started thinking about that epidural and thinking, okay, let's have a look at that. And in came the anaesthetist and had the epidural around sort of 12 noon-ish, and that helped me immensely. That was magic when that kicked in. I remember the obstetrician came in around that just after the epidural, and she said, basically, you're fully dilated, you're ready to go, but I'm going to give you another hour or so just to try and move Harry down a little bit so that it makes the pushing a little bit easier. So remember, she went off and had some lunch and came back, and then there was about an hour or so of intense pushing, and then Harry arrived at 3:15.
And did you have the urge to push with the epidural?
Yeah, I could definitely feel things. It certainly wasn't, anywhere near as painful as I'm sure it would have been, but it allowed me to feel enough to be able to push. And I certainly, could feel just sort of dull pains. But, I was able to push, Yeah,
right. And what was going through your mind at the time when you were having to push and you knew Harry was about to come out and you knew he'd have to have surgery? Like, what was happening there?
Yeah, it was all a bit of a blur. I was just quite keen to obviously try and meet Harry and see, how his little lungs were and how he arrived and if he could breathe himself and make noise and that sort of thing. So when they said, a couple more pushes to go, I thought, all right, come on, we can do this. And then there was a lot of people obviously in the room because the NICU team had come in when they knew things were close, ready to sort of grab Harry. And Harry came out and he gave a little bit of a cry. And the whole room just burst into like applause and they were cheering like, yes, so it was, it's pretty emotional.
Amazing.
They grabbed Harry and just on the side of the room they had a little bed for him that they just started doing all their procedures, and my partner was able to go over and just hold little fingers with Harry, which was good, and they intubated him straight away. So after that one little scream, silence, but it was all good. They'd warned us obviously against, just to, so we didn't freak out, that the intubation would happen regardless of how Harry was doing, they needed to sedate him pretty quickly and then intubate him and get him stabilised. So, he was silent then, and I didn't get to sort of do the natural baby on the chest and try and sort of breastfeed or anything straight away, but they did sort of hold him there for a little minute on my chest before he got whisked away. So, all a bit of a blur, but, very different, I think, to how we'd initially planned.
Oh, gorgeous. It just sends shivers down my spine, Jodie, like that whole situation with the fact that everyone clapped when he cried and, there just must have been so much emotion in the room.
Yeah, it was definitely very emotional. It was pretty emotional, when they held him up on my chest and you just got to see his little face and, you think like he did look perfect. You're just like, thank God, like here's this little boy. And you just, that night, emotions are pretty high because then all of a sudden from there being so many people in the room and, just so much anticipation, and then the NICU team took Harry off to the NICU unit. My partner was able to go with them, which was good. So I said, go, follow him. Don't let him out of your sight. And then, everyone kind of left the room and it was just me and one midwife for a while there. And she said, I'm just going to let you go and have some peace. She's like, it was all of a sudden I was by myself and I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy. What now? And then because I'd had the vaginal birth and I came out relatively unscathed of the labour, so apart from a few stitches and everything, I was allowed to go that night to the Royal Children's to visit Harry. So I was, after a shower, I was pretty much straight up and, I was in a wheelchair for a little bit, and I did, in hindsight, a lot of walking around and it was a little bit painful, but I was keen to see my little boy. So, went down the road to visit him at the Children's and was able to see him that night in his new little home.
No holding you back, hey?
Yeah. It's pretty scary. I remember seeing the, he's on hooked up to so many machines and all this beeping, and you're just looking at nurses going, what does that beep mean? Is that all right? Like, is that a siren? Is that an alarm? What is that? And they're all just reassuring us that, it's okay. He's okay. He's stable. don't worry about these alarms and things. They're just, medications running out and us refilling them, all that sort of stuff. Don't worry. And the team were just trying to keep us really informed about what was happening. So, yeah, it was intense, but it's just crazy to think now that all happened.
Yeah. So then he went on to have his surgery, didn't he? And
yeah, he was doing really well. So a couple of days out, actually, they had planned to do his surgery. I think it was on the third day. And on the second day, I'd gone into the hospital and they were able to actually, because we knew he was going into his surgery the next day and he would have quite a big road to recovery ahead after that surgery. They'd warned us that they can go downhill a little bit after the surgery just while they've been through quite a big ordeal. So the day before the surgery, they said, would you like to have a hold of him, just lying on your chest in the hospital? So we did that and, that was amazing. He just loved cuddling up like a little koala on my chest. And
was that your first proper hold?
Yeah, the second day, yeah. That was probably the biggest. We were able to get him up out of his little crib and, yeah, he just loved those cuddles. We had a couple of those big sort of 3-hour cuddles. I remember thinking at the time when we're having our cuddle, he was very warm. And when we popped him back, it took us sort of 3 nurses and me and my partner to get him back on and off me and with all his sort of wires attached and everything, put him back in his crib. And then that night, the nurse that was looking after him rang in the middle of the night and said he has spiked a fever. And basically when the babies spike a fever in the NICU, they have to treat it like it's an infection. It might not be an infection, but they have to treat it like that. So I was kicking myself because I thought I probably did that to him because he was so overheated during our cuddle that afternoon that he was just completely overheated and spiked a fever. But it wasn't an infection in the end, and they actually decided that they were going to go ahead with the surgery the next day. Yeah, the surgeon rang me straight after and just said, it was as good as they had expected the surgery to go, and they were really pleased with everything. There was no complications in pulling the organs down and popping them back where they should be. And apart from his little scar that he's got now to tell the story, then hopefully that's all going to be back to normal.
So this episode is brought to you by Baby Bee, Australian-owned and designed prams combining quality, safety and style. Not only does Baby Bee let you try their prams at home with free returns for 9 months. Yes, that's 9 months. They also offer an industry-leading 3-year warranty for total peace of mind. With thousands of 5-star reviews, around-the-clock customer care, and up to $300 of free accessories with every pram, what are you waiting for? Go visit www.babybeeonline.com and check them out for yourself. And yes, for listeners of the podcast, there is a 20% discount code. Enter FITBEE, FITBEE 20 at checkout, and T's and C's apply. What was happening with you at that stage in terms of, were you breastfeeding or did you just put that away, or did you have to go in and out with milk? What was happening?
Yeah, that was another big sort of learning curve, the whole breastfeeding situation. So Harry was in the children's all up for 3 weeks. For that first sort of 3 weeks, I was going in every day, and towards that sort of last week, because he was being fed through the tube, the nasal gastric tube, he couldn't have milk for a couple of weeks anyway, but that last sort of week we were trying to establish breastfeeding, and I'd been pumping up until that time, ready to breastfeed as soon as we could. And we tried with mixed success to get him on the breast in hospital, and then sort of on and off for the first few weeks. Sometimes he'd get the knack of it, other times he wouldn't. We struggled also initially getting him to drink even tiny bits from a bottle, just because I think he was so used to the tube by this stage. But we were able to take him home from the hospital without the tube in, which was good. That sort of happened 24 hours before we were due to take him home, which was good. So we didn't have to worry about, feeding him via the tube. But yeah, sort of breastfeeding was nowhere near as straightforward and natural as I just thought would happen. So in the end, I've just been expressing. He has about one formula feed at the moment every sort of 1 to 2 days, but the rest is just pure expressed breast milk. So yeah, it's a bit of a challenge keeping up with it, but now we're, 17 weeks along, we're in more of a rhythm of things. So yeah, it's going pretty well now.
Oh, you're doing such an amazing job with everything. Do you just find you're pumping the whole time?
Yeah, originally it did feel like that. All I was doing was trying to feed Harry, pump, getting ready for the next feed, pumping again. But then I got into a bit of a rhythm of 4 times a day or so. But I have this little app and it's quite helpful just to remind me, how many hours it's been since his last feed and how many hours since I've actually pumped and due to go again. And
what's the app called?
It's just called Baby Tracker. It's quite helpful and it charts it all. So you can, try not to get too focused on it because obviously just let sort of Harry dictate the situation. But it is useful for looking at the pattern, if he's taking more milk from the bottle over a period of time or certain things that have helped me express more on some days, or it looks like I'm low on other days and why that might have been. But yeah, my supply's been all over the place. Those early days when he was in hospital, I was pumping so much. I had a massive oversupply. The freezer was overflowing. It was just ridiculous how much milk I was producing. And then almost went completely the other way once Harry was home and I was sort of struggling to keep up. All the frozen supplies ran out and I was struggling to get anything out with the expressing. But with the help of some medication prescribed by my GP and some other sort of supplements to help, it's now sort of back again. So I think we've evened out.
Wow, it's not your everyday birth story, Jodie. It's pretty incredible. Just all the challenges you've faced and how you've stayed so amazingly positive throughout it all and hopeful and yeah,
it's a bit of a blur. You just kind of, one day at a time, you just do what you have to do, I guess, one day at a time to get through it. But we're very lucky. We've got amazing support around us. So all of our friends and family, could not have done it without them for sure. And, as I said, the Royal Children's, just phenomenal people, just amazing. The people you see in there also as patients with their families, in the scheme of things, we were really lucky compared to what some other families face. So, yeah, amazing people out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jodes, now that you're a new mum, and let's put all of Harry's extra things aside with his surgery and all that, what would you find the biggest everyday challenges would be?
The feeding surprised me. That was a bit of a challenge, just establishing the whole, bottle feeding versus breastfeeding, how do we do this? What's best? Trying to get him to drink from the breast initially. That was all a bit challenging. I think then once we sort of went, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to feed him from the bottle with the breast milk and he's feeding and that's fine. I don't know if it's got anything to do with the fact that he was sort of in the hospital for the first 3 weeks without us, but he certainly just loves to be cuddled and he just wants to be in your arms the whole time. So trying to get things done, I found quite challenging for the first little bit. But yeah, mastered the art of things with one hand and my left hand. And now he's a bit older, past the 3-month mark, it's a bit easier to sort of prop him up in the bouncer and talk to him and, he's sleeping in his cot a lot better. So being able to sort of do things myself a little bit more. And good tip for some mums out there is do stock the freezer with food. I found that was just having to think about meals and that sort of thing is not something you want to worry about when, you've got your little newborn there. We were very lucky when Harry was in hospital, particularly those first few weeks, we had a lot of people bring us meals and that was just so amazing.
So would you have any other tips for new mums?
I think my main tip is really just try and go with the flow. And that goes from the actual labour itself. And, as I said, I didn't really have too much of a plan. I knew what ideally I'd like, but I also was happy to accept that if we needed interventions and if we needed certain things, then I wasn't opposed to them. And, we had to go with the flow and listen to the medical team's advice on what they thought. The choice was always ours. So it wasn't like we were relying on other people to make decisions for us, but just being a bit more flexible, I guess, and being adaptable because, things just were changing left, right and centre every 24 hours. And then I think that's sort of also flowing into after Harry arrived and just from a normal sort of situation with a newborn, just going with the flow, something that was stressing me out one day, try not to let it worry you too much because probably in the next day or two that would be resolved and there'd be something else that, you'd be worried about. So it was just kind of like going with the flow. Things change so quickly. Harry changes so quickly. So just trying not to let things, get you down because there'll be something new the next day to follow and just not to worry about it too much.
That's saying this too shall pass.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yep.
Amazing. Before we wrap up, from a physio perspective, I have to ask you, during your pregnancy, before the diagnosis with Harry, you were one of the best attendees to all the pregnancy Pilates classes. You were there with every single session. You were amazing and you're working full time. What was your secret? Like, how did you prioritize attending your sessions and prioritizing your body and your fitness during pregnancy?
Yeah, I love the classes, especially with the COVID situation and working from home. That was like my little outlet. I'd put in when I was still working, my work calendar, like the lunchtime classes, and if I could do them live, I love doing them live. But if I had a meeting or whatever, I love the ability to kind of catch up after, and I'd try and make sure I did that in the next day or two. So I sort of love doing that from home, and then being in Ballarat in wintertime, I wasn't probably getting out and walking as much as I would like. And also towards the end with that bit of pelvic pain as well, I just do some smaller walks. But then I'd love to come back in and the classes, like I just found them, really helpful to try and mentally prepare myself as much as physically that I was going to be in the best condition possible to handle whatever was going to get thrown our way.
Yeah, you were one of the star members. Amazing. And you still are. So now you're getting into the return to running program. I love it.
I am. Yes. Let's see how we go.
To watch this space. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jodie, for sharing your incredible story. And I think it's great to bring awareness to different challenges that people face as well.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me, Kath, and thanks again for everything along the way. Like, your support's been amazing. Couldn't have done it without you, included in that mix of family and friends. So thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Jodie. And well done to your partner for, I don't hear Harry crying. So
no, Dad must have settled him because, I can't hear him at all.
Got the special touch.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Jodie.
Thanks so much, Kath.
Thanks for listening to the FitNest Mama podcast, brought to you by the FitNest Mama freebies found at www.fitnestmama.com/free. So please take a few seconds to leave a review, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and be sure to take a screenshot of this podcast, upload it to your social media, and tag me at FitNest Mama so I can give you a shout out too. Until next time, remember, an active pregnancy, confident childbirth, and strong postnatal recovery is something that you deserve. Remember our disclaimer: materials and contents in this podcast are intended as general information only and shouldn't substitute any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I'll see you soon.